Journalists Roundtable is a half-hour discussion with Pennsylvania journalists about the week's top political news and current events. Journalists Roundtable is a production of PCN, a nonprofit television network. Listeners like you make our programming possible. To learn more about PCN's mission and to support PCN with a donation, visit PCNTV.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.
Welcome to Journalists Roundtable. I'm Corey Clark. Joining us this week are Christen Smith from Center Square, Charles McElwee from Real Clear, PA, and Sam Janesch from the Philadelphia Inquirer. Thanks for joining us.
Great to be here.
Sam, let's start with you. We sit only a few days from the primary, and you recently broke down sort of a comparative profile of the two of the top candidates in the third congressional race, the two state legislators. Can you tell us about that district and how you compared and contrasted those candidates, and who are some of the other ones that we should be aware of?
Yeah, the third congressional district, Dwight Evans' seat, who's retiring this year. So we have a few state legislators, as you mentioned, State Senator Sharif Street and State Rep Chris Rabb, and then Dr. Ayla Stanford, a physician who's well known in the city for her work during COVID. And yeah, I mean, it's been a very interesting, dynamic race, kind of coming down to the wire, very competitive here on Tuesday. And yeah, I just wrote a story about Senator Street and Rep Rabb, who entered Harrisburg at the same time in 2017, with very different political career backgrounds. Senator Street, a lawyer who comes from a very connected Philadelphia political family, and Rep Rabb, who, kind of took on the Philadelphia Democratic machine to get there in the first place. And yeah, they've kind of become very different legislators, had very different styles. Representative Rabb, very progressive, kind of coming in hot in Harrisburg and introducing a whole bunch of bills about progressive tax policy and eventually a bill about reparations and, criminal justice reform. Senator Street also tackling issues like criminal justice reform, but kind of looking for some consensus building. Some folks, their colleagues and some outsiders described them, very stylistically different. Chris Rabb is kind of pitching himself as a member of the squad, potential member of the squad with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and some folks like that in D.C. if he makes it. And Senator Street, a little bit more of a kind of looking for compromise. And then we have Ayla Stanford, who has gotten a lot of outside support, especially early on in the last few months from some outside interests. And, we've had some reporting in the last couple of days that some of that has trailed off as she's had a few missteps in the last few weeks. But it's really going to come down to the wire, we think.
And you also wrote about Rabb. He's sort of tapping into some of the younger fan base, some of these young progressives. How's he doing when it comes to fundraising and things like that?
Yeah, like I mentioned, he kind of pitches himself as a quote unquote radical and outside progressive, and he's really mobilized. He's trying to mobilize a lot of younger support. He did a 3-hour live stream with a popular streamer, Hassan Piker, a few weeks ago, who came in and who's been active in some Democratic politics this year, and kind of mobilize these rallies. He has a rally coming up later this week with Representative Ocasio-Cortez in Philly, who obviously is pretty popular among kind of younger progressives. And yeah, I mean, I was with him at a rally where he was kind of with a couple hundred younger supporters, and he was saying, the Democratic establishment has kind of failed you, and they're not. I get it why you maybe not are getting out there to vote. I'm here to kind of be your voice and go to Washington and be that progressive voice for you. And at the same time, he's been able to raise a lot of money. He's actually come back. Center Street has kind of took the early lead and raised the most money overall, but Rep Rabb has raised the most money in the last few months from both small dollar and big dollar donors. So he's had the money to kind of get his message out and get some outside support as well from some progressive national groups. And yeah, he's kind of had kind of a bit of a momentum in the last few weeks here.
So he's trying to sort of contrast himself. Is he trying to portray Street as more of your traditional party man because, of all the party affiliations and leadership roles that he's had?
Yeah, yeah, and just kind of the way that they've carried themselves differently in Harrisburg. Senator Street, one of his main priorities has been legalizing recreational cannabis, which you know people wouldn't argue necessarily as a moderate position per se, but he's worked with a Republican in the Senate to get that through, hitting a wall in the Republican-controlled state Senate year after year. But Senator Street pitches himself as someone who kind of looks for those ways to work across the aisle and kind of really focus on constituent services and bringing money back into the district. And Representative Rabb, says he's there to kind of push the needle and argue for some policies that might not get initial support but might get some support down the line. And some of his detractors say that he's hasn't worked as well with his colleagues in Harrisburg. And there was a moment during a debate a few weeks ago, a WHYY debate, where Rep. Rabb was asked, why he hasn't assumed any leadership positions or been named any kind of chairman position in Harrisburg after 10 years. And he said that he turned it down because he didn't want to participate in the fundraising policies that would come along with that position. So he's still trying to really position himself as kind of an outsider, anti-establishment candidate here.
Charles McElwee, another race, not a contested primary, but in a Northeast Pennsylvania congressional race, Congressman Bresnahan versus Scranton Mayor Cognetti. You guys reported that she's outraised all candidates in the state. So what can you tell us about that, the race for that congressional seat?
Yeah, Northeastern Pennsylvania, that continues to be the battleground when it comes to understanding the modern dynamics of Pennsylvania electoral politics. And with Rob Bresnahan, you have a first-termer, but also a 50-percenter. It's important to remember that so many of the victors in the midterms in 24, they barely won their districts. And that was also the case for Bresnahan, that despite the rightward shift of that district, or certainly its realignment toward the GOP. Paige Cognetti easily won re-election as Scranton mayor last November. And really this battle, she has a fundraising prowess, no doubt, but it's a battle of the accelerationists versus the conservationists in this district. The biggest issue in Northeastern Pennsylvania right now, data centers. And this district, increasingly Republican, at a time when places like South Central Pennsylvania are making Democratic gains in voter registration numbers, Northeast PA continues to make gains on the GOP end. But the GOP, or at least even MAGA, they're with conservation. They are not for these data centers. And there's a rare bipartisan consensus that if you talk to any voter in Northeastern Pennsylvania, they're opposed to any of the data centers proposed. And at the same time, you have places like Archbald, Lackawanna County, where woodlands are getting cleared for speculative development. And really where last year, in the past 2 years, Governor Shapiro really made the push initially for data centers, especially as they were going to be proposed centered around the Hazleton area. So when it comes to Bresnahan and Cognetti, it's certainly the national issues, the economy, demographics too. It's really the most Latino district in the state besides the Lehigh Valley. Will the Latino vote turn out, or there's a swing vote that will turn against the Republican Party as opposed to what happened in 24? And really a referendum, even at the federal level in the congressional race on the data centers. Bresnahan is for leaving it to the local leaders to decide with the support of labor. Cognetti is saying, hey, we need to develop data centers in brownfields, industrial sites. So I think when it comes to this district, the biggest issue in November will be who has the most clear message and alignment with the voters on the issue of data centers.
Another really interesting piece of that race is the union endorsement involvement. I think the Bresnahan versus Cognetti really encapsulates a change that we've seen, a sea change, quite frankly, in how union endorsement is playing into the Republican Democrat divide. And in this particular race, the unions are split. Bresnahan has stacked up a lot of union support, which traditionally is not something that Republicans have been able to do prior to Trump, really. But in this particular race, it is something that is not only weighing in, but it's a little bit of a controversy. The Teamsters met for their statewide convention a few weeks ago. And although they on the floor voiced support for an endorsement for Cognetti, they reached out to the center square about a week later to say that that wasn't accurate, that they had withdrawn that support. So there seems to be a lot of disagreement among, even the smallest, shouldn't say smallest, but even among the most local union members about where they're going in this race.
Where does that come from, Christen? Because traditionally the unions have been supportive of Democratic candidates, but is that different for that area?
That area is really becoming a strong bellwether of how elections will go in Pennsylvania. But again, the union support for Republicans really started shifting back in Trump's first election, and now certainly again in 2024. And that has a lot to do with the building trades and our economy surrounding energy development. Now these data centers, there is a shift in priorities, whereas the Democrats historically were a party of the working man. Over the decades, union members have expressed the feeling that the party has left them and that platform behind, and that's something that's really been adopted under the Republican platform in the last several election cycles.
Well, Christen, we'll get back to the congressional races in a second, but since we have you here talking about data centers and energy, talk about the piece you wrote about the ongoing Reggie controversy. You guys reported that there's a lot of money on the table that Pennsylvania isn't getting. Talk about that and how it relates to things like data centers.
It's actually a really interesting perspective on how our 6-year back and forth debate about joining the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative hurt Pennsylvania. A quick overview of that program is that energy producers would be taxed for the amount of carbon emissions that they created, with the goal of eventually lowering that amount of emissions to zero by 2040. Now, of course, in Pennsylvania, unlike all of the other states in this pact, we are an energy producer. We're the top energy producer in the nation. And in our 13-state power grid, we provide 25% of the power. So something like this would impact our economy incredibly differently than, say, other members of the pact, such as New Jersey or Maryland, who in our power grid rely heavily on Pennsylvania natural gas and much to a lesser extent coal, but also nuclear to support their renewable energy projects and their own much more aggressive renewable energy goals. So we ultimately decided we're not going to join that program. So how does that still continue to impact us, even though we've backed away from it? So during that 6-year time period, a lot of energy development as far as natural gas stopped. We lost, comparative to Ohio, where there's also a strong energy economy, we lost, I want to say in the range of 80%, only 9% of our projects converted from proposals to actual implementation, whereas in Ohio, they only saw a slight drop down from 60 to down to 43%, which was in a large part due to declining natural gas prices. So we lost $5 billion in investment. Now, how does that tie into data centers, considering this conversation about data centers truly didn't exist even 3 years ago, but of course has exploded, not only in terms of the industry, but even down to the basic level, to the amount of people who are seeing encroachments on their own land for these data centers. So, because we weren't thinking about this even a few years ago, but we were already in a position where our renewable development goals across the power grid were uh, aggressive and putting a strain and indicating that we were not going to have enough capacity to meet those needs, which would in turn raise electricity prices and, at worst case scenario, cause blackouts and power rationing and things like that. Although, to be clear, the power grid operator, PJM, never said that they never believed we would get to that point. But still, it pushed us into a much more uncomfortable position than we're used to being in. Now that we have data centers, that problem is tenfold. Again, the demand on energy, the demand on land and resources, the demand on water, it is something that we did not conceive of, but now is a very pressing issue. Pennsylvania has become one of the targets for data center development. I think we're probably only second to a place like Virginia. So all of these things have coalesced. And the big question is, how much could Pennsylvania have solved that problem? And we don't know. We don't know how that 6-year period of uncertainty really impacted things. Governor Josh Shapiro he has not abandoned the idea of the greenhouse gas initiative. He still wants to limit emissions in Pennsylvania. He just has a state version of the program, which critics say would have the same problems effectively. So it's not that those programs have gone anywhere, because the Republican controlled Senate does not support that and has been instrumental in preventing Reggie from happening in the first place. So it stands to reason we don't know where we're going from here, but the data center conversation is certainly a new factor that makes all of this more uncertain.
Speaking of Governor Shapiro, Sam, you wrote about how he's getting involved, switching back to these congressional races, the Bucks County seat, the competitive Democratic primary to see who will run against Congressman Fitzpatrick. Governor Shapiro got involved in that race.
Yeah, he did. He's really gotten involved in all of the competitive congressional races at this point, and there's 4 of them across the state. And the one that Democrats are questioning maybe the most is this Fitzpatrick seat in Bucks County outside Philadelphia, because Fitzpatrick has been, kind of a moderate Republican who's been able to kind of have a specific brand there and have some staying power in the last decade. And Shapiro and him appear to have an okay relationship. Fitzpatrick talked about that recently on a podcast, but Shapiro came out and supported his opponent, potential opponent in the primary, Bucks County Commissioner Bob Harvey, who is the first challenger to Fitzpatrick, who's actually won in the county statewide. And the party there thinks that he has the best shot maybe to get Fitzpatrick and unseat him this year. So Shapiro's throwing his political weight behind him, which every Democrat in the state kind of wants. And we'll see how much he kind of comes in and is in the district campaigning for him after the primary. It seems like the primary is going to go to Bob Harvey's way, but he does have a challenger on Tuesday. So I think we're waiting to see how much Shapiro gets involved there versus going up to the Lehigh Valley district and then to the Harrisburg district and the Scranton one, and how he kind of divvies up his time and resources.
Charles, that first district has been a very much a battleground for both Fitzpatricks who've held that seat. Can you talk about the composition of that area?
Well, look, Bucks County, it has long been considered the bellwether in terms of its importance in electoral statewide politics, perhaps more diminished compared to, let's say, 20 years ago. It certainly was 20 years ago in '06 where this was the district that really showed where voters stood on foreign policy. So that year it was a referendum on the Iraq War, and that hurt the late Mike Fitzpatrick, which led to the election of Pat Murphy, a military vet, and based on his opposition to the war, and really a referendum on the Bush era. Fast forward 20 years, Brian Fitzpatrick is running at a time when all polling indicates that Americans, and including Pennsylvania voters, are deeply opposed to the Iran war. And how will that play out at the local level? Those dynamics, the national issues at the congressional level. And certainly this district, you have the lower end of the county, Lower Bucks, which is kind of like sticking Luzerne County in a small geographical area, historically ethnic Catholic, blue collar Democrat, conservative, that has shifted Republican, and in turn fueled the gains, including the Republican voter registration advantage and the fact that Trump won the county in 24. But how does that all play out this year? It's a county broken into really three areas: Upper Bucks, which Quakertown continues to experience growth and driven in part by the Lehigh Valley; Central Bucks, which is always up for grabs, but certainly trending blue with places like Newtown, Middletown Township; and then the lower Bucks, where will the voters there hold a referendum on Trump and therefore punish Fitzpatrick? That with inflation, the economy, foreign entanglements, they will shift against the Republican Party and will show that in spite of the realignment of the past decade or so, support for the GOP isn't assured.
And Sam, you mentioned the Lehigh Valley seat and Governor Shapiro getting involved in that one. Talk about that primary matchup, and then also what we can look forward to in the fall.
I've been really interested in this seat. So Governor Shapiro and most of the Democratic "quote unquote" establishment has come out for Bob Brooks, the statewide firefighter union president and retired firefighter in Bethlehem. They're really leaning into his, working class background and kind of persona. But it's turned out to be a competitive primary with three other candidates: a former federal prosecutor, Ryan Crosswell, former staffer for Senator Bob Casey, Carol Abanda-Durstein, and a twice elected Northampton County Executive, Lamont Clore. And Bob Brooks has gotten a lot of the institutional support and, about $1 million in outside spending from a PAC that's backed by a lot of the unions that he's aligned with. But there's been some late spending here by a group that some folks think is a Republican operation that's trying to lift up Mr. McClure to prevent Bob Brooks and Mr. Crosswell from getting to the general election. So there's some interesting twists here at the end of this race, and Governor Shapiro helped recruit Bob Brooks and has supported him. And this district, Representative Ryan McKenzie, has represented it since 2024, winning only very narrowly against former Democrat Susan Wild. And it's considered one of the most competitive districts in the entire country. And there's going to be a lot of eyes on it, like there always is in these kind of swing seats in the Lehigh Valley. But, this is one where, people argue the control of the House could come down to it. So there's going to be a lot of interest kind of nationally kind of converging onto this area right after the primary.
Christen, I don't want to run out of time before we talk about the story you did about the paid leave debate. And not only that, paid leave for nurses, and it feels like we've had a nursing shortage in this state or this country for a very long time. Can you talk about both of those things? Why is there such a big nursing shortage, and how does paid leave play into that?
Pennsylvania actually has the worst nursing shortage of any state in the country. We're down about 20,000 unfilled positions. The SEIU Healthcare Pennsylvania, the nurses that participate in that union argue that a common thread would be the state's lack of paid leave and their hospital in Pittsburgh, UPMC McGee Women's Health. They argue that their very brief paid leave policy of 2 weeks is certainly not enough, and that it doesn't hurt only just the nurses in the union, but also patients too. And they want to see not just paid leave for them, but for workers and parents and families all across the state and all across the country. Quite frankly, they've gone as far as Fetterman's office in DC to ask for this. Interestingly enough, the Allegheny County Department of Health, again, where UPMC is headquartered, they recently advanced a proposal to mandate 18 paid weeks for leave, and that would apply to anyone, not just county employees. So there's some real momentum, particularly in that region, but statewide too. We've had state legislation that moved out of the House that would implement paid leave for state workers, partial reimbursement. But there is certainly a bipartisan push in recent years to make this a reality. And again, Pennsylvania is perhaps the only state in the Northeast region that doesn't have state policy on paid leave. And so these nurses truly believe that if that changed, that would go a long way to addressing that nursing gap.
Charles, before we get out of here, give us the main thing that you'll be watching on Tuesday night.
Looking to see if progressives prevail. Could there be an upset in South Central Pennsylvania, for example, that Justin Douglas somehow pulls it out against Janelle Stelson in the fight for Scott Perry's seat? And certainly in Philadelphia for Dwight Evans' seat, Rabb pulls it out, because this is really long-term a test for Governor Josh Shapiro. He wants 4 for 4, independent of the Philadelphia district, the most Democratic in the nation, but he wants 4 for 4 seats in the midterms to tell that story in, as we all know, likely run for president in 2028. And what is a modern Democratic Party? Does it look like what Shapiro wants it to be, which is more of a throwback to the aughts when he first prevailed? Or is it the leftward turn, the generational gap, that the Zoomers are not down with the party as viewed by Josh Shapiro, and that could be a challenge for him with these congressional races?
Sam, real quick, where will you be on Tuesday?
I'll be at one of the parties in Philly for one of the 3 candidates that we're watching, and I think we're unsure how it'll go, but we're kind of along the same lines as Charles was talking about. We have the progressive dynamics versus maybe the more consensus building, quote unquote moderate, and then a kind of an outsider candidate. And I think it'll tell a lot about where the party and the city wants the direction of this to go.
All right, we're going to end it right there. Thanks to our guests, Christen Smith, Charles McElwee, and Sam Janesch. And thank you for watching Journalist Roundtable. Don't forget our primary night coverage Tuesday night right here on PCN. I'm Corey Clark. Good night.
Full episodes of politics and policy content like the program you just listened to are available to stream with the PCN Select app. Discover other shows like the Capitol Preview, On the Issues, candidate interviews, and more. To learn more about PCN's mission and to support PCN with a donation, visit PCNTV.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.